I will admit that I've had my passing moments of fear over the past couple of years where I'm just like, okay, is one day a hypersonic missile from Russia gonna come down on Chicago? You know, and, because didn't New York City have like an advertisement on television about what to do if we're nuked?
So there's been a nuclear attack. Don't ask me how or why, just know that the big one has hit, okay? So what do? There are 3 important steps that I want you to remember.
All right, welcome to the Cutrone Zone. With us again this week is the last Marxist, genius, track coach, ultra-leftist, conservative, Chris Cutrone. Chris, thanks for coming on. We're going to be talking about authoritarianism.
Yes.
This week. And I've read both of the essays that you sent to me. One of them was called The Mass Psychology of Capitalist Democracy. The other is called Critical Authoritarianism, on Adorno's remarks on the authoritarian personality. I'll put links to both those in the description. They're also in your book, Marxism and Politics.
They're both in the book, absolutely.
Yep, and I will link to that as well. But I have to admit, I've read them both, and I found them very compelling. But there was something that I couldn't quite understand.
Okay.
And like I felt like, if I were asked to recapitulate this on a test, or if I wanted to make a video explaining it, I could do it because I would just mouth some of the words. But there's something I didn't quite sink in, and I think it has to do with the name of this channel, with the name of our company, Sublation. This idea of sublation is very difficult when it comes to sublating individualism and collectivism, say, or that I find it tricky. And perhaps it will only be something that I can fully understand if we start to actually do it. But do you think that these essays are particularly difficult, or am I being kind of thick when it comes to the ideas?
Well, rereading them, one of them, The Mass Psychology of Capitalist Democracy, was written for an academic conference on psychoanalysis and politics by some members who have since left and started their own journal. And why am I forgetting the name of their journal? It's the Society for Psychoanalytic Inquiry, the SPI. I forget what their journal is called. They might be also involved with more than one journal, but they also get involved with the DSA. And I was on with some older New Left era leftists who were influenced by psychoanalysis. And I was trying to make a certain kind of intervention. And rereading it now, it's from kind of early days in Platypus. It's from more than 10 years ago. And I realized that I was being still very academic. Critical Authoritarianism, on the other hand, I wrote for publication in November of 2016 when I had a pretty good sense of the likelihood of Trump's election. And I had already written Why Not Trump? And, we were publishing, just so happened to be publishing that Adorno remarks on the authoritarian personality, previously unpublished, previously undiscovered, in like typescript, manuscript form in the archive. And I think that one's more punchy, more like direct, more sort of provocative, more the style that I've gotten into in later years. So they're very different stylistically, I realized. And academic means a little bit elliptical, a little bit indirect, a little bit like polite, So it's there, but it's not like rhetorically hitting. And so I think that might have been part of it as well. And, but I was trying to make a gentle provocation. And it was in the Obama era. So The Mass Psychology of Capitalist Democracy. I don't think that people think of like Obama as an authoritarian politician. And yet, of course, he was sort of, in some ways, infamously so. For instance, when he said that he served as a projection screen onto which anyone could apply their desires or fears, right? I don't know if you remember the Tea Party protests where they had like, placards with Obama, and he was like, I think he had like a Hitler mustache. Like, it's sort of, we chuckle about it now, but when people say, "Oh, Trump's a fascist," well, don't forget that there was a kind of an upsurge, a populist upsurge in the Republican Party that considered Obama to be a fascist,
right,
and plausibly so. Plausibly so. Now, of course, that's coming, I guess people would say, from a libertarian standpoint as opposed to a leftist standpoint. But, again, we are living in a time when the meaning of these things is really in question and up for grabs. So, I mean, I'd say pedagogically, one of the things that I've emphasized in my approach to Marxism is this traditional left-right distinction, at least in American politics of recent decades, but maybe going back to the New Deal era. Collectivism is the left and individualism is the right. Right? And, so I also have in mind, you asked me to read your Compact article published today.
Yeah.
And, about the difference between the working class and labor. And, I feel like a typical leftist response to what you were talking about how Trump won the working class, but he lost labor, meaning the labor organizations endorsed Kamala, except for the Teamsters that didn't endorse anyone.
Right.
Led by the guy who spoke at the Republican National Convention, Sean O'Brien.
Right.
There are two Seans, Sean Fain and Sean O'Brien. I confuse them. Sean O'Brien, I guess, is Teamsters, and Sean Fain is UAW.
I think that's right. I can double check.
The famous Sean's. But I'm just thinking a typical leftist response to your article would be, well, the workers voted as individuals rather than in their collective interest for Trump. In other words, they voted for their individual interest, but they voted against their collective interest.
Well, I think that my article overcomes that objection.
I think so too.
Because I point to how labor coming out of the state limits and controls and actually is designed to stifle working class politics. So the collective interests of the working class would be to gain political power for their class rather than to be herded into the state to be managed and to create kind of false class harmony. And so, yeah, that, I mean, if they were to say that, I would think that some leftists who would object in that way would simply have to ignore
a lot of the article.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't a very long article.
It's not a very long article, but I'm used to this, Doug. They ignore everything, right? And they just say, in other words, they have like a knee-jerk response, and they slot everything in, like the Republicans are individualists, the Democrats are collectivists, etc. And but at the same time, the Democrats will call Trump a fascist, which means that he's some kind of a collectivist, but it's like the wrong kind of collectivism. It's white Christian national collectivism as opposed to Rainbow Coalition, people of color and labor and LGBTQ collectivism.
Right, although that is no longer even a viable thing to argue because Trump had a multi-ethnic voting bloc put him into office. So I would say Trump represents some sort of civic nationalist collective.
Yeah, a different kind of collective, but then people, of course, say, well, it's all based on genocide and slavery and U.S. imperialism, and it's the labor aristocracy. But, so they find ways, it's all sophistry, of course, shoehorn into their Procrustean bed, their framework. Again, so individualism and collectivism, and then the other point would be, statism versus a kind of, libertarian or anarchist, kind of social, civil society. I think this is what we're dealing with in our era. I think the entire millennial left era up to the present has been struggling with these old antinomies of capitalism, but I don't think that people recognize them as antinomies of capitalism. I think that they think it's like one is right and the other is wrong. Like they don't recognize the contradiction itself is the point.
Right. And this is what I was telling you I was having a little bit of trouble with, even though I know the term sublation, I've read Hegel, and in the abstract and philosophical terms I can understand what it means, but when it comes to the political, I do struggle a little bit because I think I ended up in the last year or two siding with individualism as opposed to the collective, because I saw the collective on the left as going way off course, and I thought there was a need for independence, and that would mean for me my independence as an individual.
There's an authoritarian statism to the Democrats. There is a kind of totalitarianism. I mean, it's an irony of history, but we should be on guard for such ironies of history. Again, Hegel would tell us that, the party that represents a certain principle apparently might end up exemplifying the opposite principle.
Right.
So now, but again, the left has its sophistry. They call fascism individualistic. And really, this is where I think that Adorno is very helpful. So both of my essays are focused on Adorno, and Adorno does have a way of taking up that diagnosis, meaning when we're talking about authoritarianism, we are talking about individualism, but not in the form of like a bourgeois independent individual, but rather a kind of atomized, isolated individual who becomes part of a mass. Right? So like basically the idea is, and this is, people are familiar with this from the Frankfurt School, I suppose, that class struggle was replaced by mass society, mass politics, mass culture, and that, mass is opposite of class, but not just because it effaces class distinctions, the mass, although that's part of it, but really because we're dealing with atomized individuals rather than individuals who, through their reason, voluntarily join a collective political project. Right? So there's another essay in the book on, the racket theory of Horkheimer, Horkheimer on class, on sociology and class, where Horkheimer says, the end of the class struggle means that sociology becomes appropriate, whereas Marxists would say sociology reifies society. That in fact, the end of the class struggle, the working class struggling for socialism in both a civic, social, and political way, means that suddenly this reified view of society is more accurate. Right, that otherwise you would say, well, no, there isn't society. Why isn't there society? Because there's a social contradiction. Right, and so again, it does come back to contradiction. So I think we're not used to thinking about it politically. I mean, I think this has been a theme for us over the years now on the Cutrone zone. That I think that thinking about this politically, thinking about the contradiction of capitalism manifesting politically, is unfamiliar. It's unusual. I don't think that a lot of people on the left, I think the people on the left are what everyone thinks Marxists are. They're economic determinists and class reductionists. And they've just extrapolated class reductionism to include the identity politics groups. So they're also race reductionist and gender reductionist, so they just they do actually do this, and so why would we be against, class reductionism and etc. or intersectional is just a kind of agglomeration of reductionisms, is that, well, what about the individual? The individual
Right.
as such, right? The individual who's an individual despite being, a cisgendered, heterosexual white man. What about does that really, does being a cisgendered heterosexual white man really make one like all other cisgendered heterosexual white men? I think there's a suspicion that people have on the left that like being an individual is a privilege of being a straight white man.
Yes, I know. And right, let's talk about that a little bit, because I feel like what I've heard in the last year or two is that not only being heterosexual, cisgendered white man is what it means to be an individual, but also to be an individualist or to privilege independence and individuality means that you are probably a Gen X cisgender, heterosexual white man. Like that. There's even an ageism that is thrown in.
It's a funny thing because on the one hand, we seem to be encountering authoritarianism for the very first time. And yet Adorno thought this was already clearly manifest in the 1920s.
Right.
100 years ago, right? So,
well, I thought we were in an authoritarian culture in 2002, and I thought we were in an authoritarian culture in 1992. And, but this seems
the
different.
80s, for Christ's sake.
Well, in the 80s, but I was a teenager, so I wouldn't have said it quite like that. But yes, I thought Ronald Reagan was an authoritarian menace. Sure. Yeah. What
made the yuppies objectionable was not that they were individuals, but they were all the same. It was like the man in the gray flannel suit come back.
Yeah. And now I feel what is different is that the yuppies are all calling
pierced
themselves,
and tattooed.
Yeah, and commies.
Queer. Oh, they're commies. Yeah. That's the problem with the yuppies now, is that they're commies. No, I mean, that's going to get us into the PMC business. No, I mean, it's like, so I do think getting back down to brass tacks.
Yeah.
Like, I know that you guys in Sublation, you were talking about Rousseau. You read the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and you read On the Social Contract. I think that Rousseau is a real challenge. So you were talking with Matt McManus this week, and you raised Rousseau. And Rousseau was like, McManus was like, Rousseau's very important, but sort of too big. Mm-hmm. And I thought, but that tells you a lot, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Why is Rousseau so big? Because actually Rousseau's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand, pretty simple.
I thought so. Yeah.
And we can quibble with some of the details, especially in his political vision of the state. But really, it is commonsensical at the same time that it's sort of estranging to kind of confront what we already know. And yet, I've definitely experienced this in academia. People have a great difficulty dealing with Rousseau. I feel like there's a host of ideas that people have that get in the way of just dealing with these things straightforwardly. Like, look, society is composed of individuals and is a collective reality that transcends the individuals, but also makes our individuality possible.
Yeah.
Is that too dialectical? I get,
Maybe, but that is something that reading Marx really brought home to me. Even if it was on a economic level originally, but no, that's absolutely the case. But yeah, go on.
So I think that, I was thinking about this in terms of like the arcanum of Marxism, like it's easy to get into the weeds of Marxism. And yet I have, and sometimes when I'm reading my old essays, like these essays, like especially the Mass Psychology of Capitalist Democracy, I was like, oh, I'm being very simple here, like it felt very like, okay, I'm keeping it very pedestrian, and I don't know if it's like, do I like my own writing, because I want it to be more, but then it's like, well, and that generally do speak in generalizations, and I know it frustrates some of my audience.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I feel like, but we have to sort of think about the basic categories.
Right.
You know, like, what are we talking about? You know, in other words, like, you know, like freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
It is about individuals.
Absolutely.
It is. You can't
Yeah.
like jump to the level of, well, capitalist corporations and blah, blah, blah. It's like, but wait a second, you know? Or even just the more difficult one, which shouldn't be difficult at all, which is that freedom of speech is about the individual's right to read and see and hear things. It's not about right to express things. I mean, it is about right to express things, but really, when you abrogate that right, you're robbing people's right to receive things, and you're depriving them of the ability to think for themselves.
Yeah. You know, tomorrow I'm going to be putting out a conversation I had with Jeff Schollenberger from Compact about the Twitter files. And at one point I say the way they censored people was not only they censored people who were super spreaders, people who came up with ideas that lots of people shared. And that would, you know, by taking out the spreader account, or the spreader post, they would cancel out hundreds of thousands of other posts that people repeat.
Reposts, yeah.
Yeah. And he said, well, if you're going to count, you know, retweets as speech. And I was like, well, of course it's
Of course it is.
And
because if someone chooses to repost something, it means something else.
And so people have been canceled for their retweets. If you don't, you know, right? So, and also, when you cancel someone's retweet, you're keeping people from reading it, which is the other side of free speech. Exactly.
Yep.
And
yep.
And so, yeah, anyway, people do understand this, ultimately. They just sort of...
I don't know if they do, or they don't trust themselves. They don't trust others, and they don't trust themselves. You know, it's like they're afraid to read things or see things or hear things because it might, like, pollute their mind or something. You know, I mean, obviously there's a great deal of authoritarianism in the air, on the left and on the right. You know, you know, among the Democrats and among the Republicans, a little bit different than left and right. But, you know, it's like when Elon Musk talks about the woke mind virus, it's like, well, it turns out there is such a thing as the woke mind virus. It's a distant cousin of the dead brainworm in RFK's head. But you know, when you say the woke mind virus, then it kind of makes you think, okay, you need to inoculate people against it. You know, you need some antiviral medication. You need to quarantine it. You need to stop the spread or something, you know? And it's kind of like, you know, I mean, I live in the world of the woke mind virus infected. I do, the zombie land. And, you know, that's a reality, but at the same time, what are we going to do about it? You know? And so the culture wars, it seems to be a battle of who gets to suppress.
Yeah, you cannot get rid of the woke mind virus by inoculating people against it, or pre-bunking, or canceling classes, or
curricula.
You're just going to have to insist on the right for people to have debates, the right for people to be critical, and that hopefully will be a good portion of what would be enough, you know, to overcome.
I hope. I mean, it's a strange thing. Who's the guy? There's a guy in Britain who's like the British National Party or English Defence League. I forget. Is it like? I feel like it's Tommy somebody, right?
Oh, Tommy Robinson.
Yeah, he was like cured of his like white nationalism by like meeting with like a Muslim British guy or whatever. Like some intervention was made, and it was like, oh, we get along, so I'm no longer a racist. But then he ends up like going back or something. You know, it's like, and then it's like, well, was he sincere? Yeah, he was probably sincere. And so we do have to think about, okay, what are the conditions for racism, for sexism? I mean, really misogyny. Although, of course, women resent men too. There is misandry for sure.
And women resent women, and men resent men.
Oh well, there certainly is that. Well, there's misandry among men and there's misogyny among women. I mean, of course, there's misogyny among women. Like, I feel like some of the worst misogynists are women, of course, right? And how do we understand that? And that's where I think that the authoritarian psychology, and specifically the Freudian psychoanalytic approach to that.
Right. Okay. That is a great segue, because I wanted to bring up what I think was maybe what gave me the most difficulty in your mass psychology of capitalism piece, which was the mass psychology of capitalist democracy, was the Freudian aspect of it, which, I've read some Freud, but I wouldn't call myself well read in Freud. And and maybe I have some defenses against Freud, in the typical way.
Everybody does, right?
Yeah. But there was this idea that what you fear is also what you wish for, and which I think I understand. But then to make that into a societal and political reality is difficult. But I thought about it a little bit, and I tweeted something out kind of as a way to try to incorporate what I just read and to express it. And, where else do you express anything but on Twitter or X? So I tweeted out, nuclear war is something many of us secretly want, even as we fear it. It was something we were promised would happen. It would relieve us all of the responsibility of being human beings tasked with freedom.
I mean, I have to say that, when you were freaking out about the World War III and nuclear warfare, I just thought, oh, he wishes it. And I kind of just wish that you wouldn't wish it, so to speak. And okay, so what we're talking about when we're talking about like conditions for racism and sexism and phobia, I think I invoked Fanon saying that racism was repressed homosexuality, right? Emphasis on repressed. Meaning, can you experience your homosexuality in an unconflicted way? And maybe if you can't, then you have a kind of phobia of men and masculinity, right? And a kind of resentment, right? Rather than understanding, you desire it, right? And so, the basic point would be that capitalism creates social conditions that brings out pre-Oedipal psychology. In other words, this is a overstimulating, traumatizing social reality that we're living in. It's not a kind of sheltered middle class, Victorian era circumstance for the individual. Right? It is, poison gas warfare in trenches. So, I point out that Freud turned his attention this way around World War I. And so to just say capitalism, he's Austrian. So Austria is a little bit rustic. Still to this day, if you go to Austria, it's a very quaint country. It's Southern Europe, Vienna is not a megalopolis. It's not Berlin. It's not London or Paris. It's not New York. It's like twee country, And so you just get a sense of like, did capitalism really make it to Austria? Kind of. They might have skipped the intense heavy industry phase of capitalism. They might have gone straight from like petty bourgeois to postmodernist. Information economy or whatnot. Service economy. They might have gone seamlessly from domestic service, servants to the service economy.
To tourism.
Yeah. Well, there's that. Europe is also that. And so you do get this sense of like, okay, well, capitalism, like real capitalism, and the bourgeois individual. There's a contradiction there. At an experiential level, at a psychological level, it impacts. And that this might bring out this kind of authoritarianism in people, because that's the way Freud understands authoritarian psychology, that it's rooted in pre-Oedipal psychology. It's rooted in a dyadic relationship in which the other is a mirror, as like a projection screen, what I mentioned earlier about Obama. So when people, when Obama said people project whatever they want onto me, either out of desire or fear, hope or trepidation, of course, that's to be understood as not anything about Obama. It's about the people who project on him, right? Who see him as evil or see him as good,
Yeah, and they actually would project, if I'm reading you correctly, their desire through fear, or their, right?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing. So, I mean, we are living in, I think, the delayed reaction to still 2008. It's playing out, right? And so I think that the Obama election was our first election that was a response to the war on terror and the financial crisis, Great Recession. And I think that the disappointment with Obama is the thing to think about, right? Rather than the backlash against Obama. I think that I mentioned that, when I asked my family about Obama, they're like, what a disappointment, because they voted for Obama. And, and I would say they didn't have unrealistic expectations. They actually had realistic expectations, and they were disappointed. So they may not, they're authoritarian in some ways, but they may not be exactly what we're talking about. Right. Or maybe that part of themselves wasn't as prominent. So what we're talking about here, and, thinking about like Weimar Germany or something, how did the Germans go from being the most technologically and scientifically advanced country in Europe, the land of German idealism and Goethe humanism? How did they ever become Nazis? Right? Well, it could very well be that there was a trauma there. And, in other words, that brought out people's authoritarianism, and that this would have to be seen across the spectrum, meaning not just, I think that that's the other thing that people have this mistaken notion of, is that like some people are authoritarian and other people are not, rather than everybody is more or less authoritarian. Everyone, given the right circumstances, will be a fascist, basically. You put people under enough pressure, that will happen. At least at some level. I mean, some people might be able to recover from it, might be able to take care of each other in the concentration camp, as opposed to just take advantage of each other. But generally speaking, we do have to reckon with the fact that this is across the board. And that was really my point.
That was one of the really difficult things to take up after the Holocaust, was how the authoritarianism was in the camps amongst the concentration camp victims, rather than simply
the
Nazi party. That the survivor's guilt is often based on that, the feeling that the best among us died, is what they would say. People who lived through that would say, and that
they didn't have it in them to survive, to do what was necessary to survive.
Right, exactly. And so that shows that the problem was not a matter of individuals and their, original sin or something,
right?
But rather, it was a social reality. Authoritarianism was a social reality.
And I think that this is, again, if we forego the good guys, bad guys, the friend enemy, the us them, all of that, by the way, is authoritarian.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Right? Like that whole thing is authoritarian. We read Carl Schmitt this past summer in Platypus, and he's like, if you take people's ability to have the friend enemy distinction away, you take away their human dignity. And I thought, okay, look, okay, yeah, authoritarian people still deserve to be treated with dignity. But, in other words, the dignity.
How did he see the friend enemy distinction being so vitally important to maintaining human dignity?
Because it's about values, right? So basically his critique of liberal democracy and capitalism is that it reduces everyone to one set of values to which they can't object without being dehumanized. Meaning, unless you're interested in the life of commerce and entertainment, then you are seen as some kind of, violent, subhuman, criminal. You're kind of excommunicated from the species, right? So basically, he thinks this is like the end of politics, and his vision of politics is feudalism. It's what the feudal lords did. Like, he understands it's not what the peasants did. But he just thought you can't have a community with its own values unless it's able to distinguish itself from other communities with different values. In other words, to treat other values as inimical to one's own values, right? That you can't just pretend, oh, we're all the same, because then you're getting rid of what makes humans human. Namely, that we're not just animals who want to be well fed and petted. We are humans, and that means we're political creatures. Zoon politikon. We create communities. We decide what our values are, and we're willing to fight and die and kill and be killed for them.
I always thought that the capacity for reason was how one got over or surpassed the need for a friend-enemy distinction. So, for instance, different values, you don't have to tolerate values that you oppose, but you do have to avoid resorting to coercion or merely might in order to enforce them. That the challenge, if your values are challenged, you should be able to defend them, and vice versa. Maybe that makes me a liberal.
Yeah, that is very liberal, or it's enlightenment. Because that's the other thing that people are, like Schmidt, are unhappy with. They're sort of like, they think there's two souls to the Enlightenment, and that Enlightenment, didn't really play out as well as it could. That it kind of went into a kind of a mush in liberal bourgeois society. The thing is, should we tolerate values that we disagree with? Well, it all depends on what we mean by tolerate.
Right.
It's not like one has to adopt them for oneself.
Or certainly it doesn't mean that one has to silently accept them.
Either.
Or like, as an example, right now there's a lot of debates over whether or not trans women should be in women's bathrooms. Right?
Oh my God, Nancy Mace, the representative. And I guess there was just a newly elected, the first trans member of Congress.
Right.
A representative from Delaware, a Democrat, and Nancy Mace, who's famous, first woman to go to the Citadel. She broke a certain kind of gender barrier, but also evidently, she says, a victim of sexual assault and, sexual violence, sexual abuse. I mean, I'm not sure if those are separate things or if it's one thing. But, she is claiming to be triggered by the prospect of a penis in a woman's bathroom. Well, okay. Look, I think that these issues, right? Because I know this from being gay. It's like, do what you want, but don't force it on me. And it's kind of like, okay, well, what does forcing it on you mean? Does it mean that I have to keep a polite silence? Don't ask, don't tell. And that might be okay, because it may not be appropriate for me to be talking about my sexuality under all circumstances. Do you know, like, not all conversations are appropriate for discussing sexuality.
But if you go to a dance club with your partner and you want to dance with him, should you be harassed for that?
Right. I mean, look, I was aware of the fact that I was in a minority. And therefore, being in a minority, I understood, in a way that I still understand. Look, I'm a Marxist. Like, I understand that when you're in a minority, you have to respect the majority. right? In other words, you can't, if you flout the values of the majority, you shouldn't be surprised that you're going to get a negative reception, right? In other words, if you run into a church,
sometimes that's the whole point of flouting them, is to get that negative reaction, right?
Oh yeah, there certainly is that. But again, I feel like that's adolescent or something. It's okay, but like again, it's like, well, then you're risking getting a very bad response. You're
right,
risking...
but the aim is to change the majority values by flouting them.
I guess that is the idea. I guess I've always understood that majority values aren't changed that way.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, that it's not done through confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's an obvious injustice. Do you know what I mean? Like where you can, where people will not feel like you are just trying to insult them.
Right.
But where you are challenging them in something that they already know is kind of not right.
Right, which relies again on these liberal values of I guess toleration and reason.
Yeah. And reason, right? In other words, that, like, look, were the civil rights protesters who did the sit-ins at the lunch counter, were they trying to anger white people, or were they trying to appeal to their reason?
That second thing. They were saying, look, we all are Americans. We're all citizens. We're all human beings. You really don't have a good reason not to.
You don't have a good reason. Right. And, and it happened when it happened, meaning it didn't happen in the 1900s, height of Jim Crow implementation so much. It happened much later, meaning after a certain kind of social integration had already taken place. In other words, it's like you are working side by side with me at the office or at the store. So why can't we have lunch in the same place? Or why can't we ride in the same part of the bus? You know? But that did actually have to happen. Like there had to actually be social integration. So I guess, my attitude has been, because obviously I'm a rebel, I'm a leftist, I'm a Marxist, I'm a revolutionary, right? But somehow I knew that you don't just like offend people for the sake of offending them. And you don't make them feel like they are inherently wrong, that their existence is wrong. In other words, like you want straight people to accept you, but you don't want to say being straight is wrong.
No.
Right?
No.
And yet that's the mistake. I mean, I guess maybe I've always been a conservative, Doug. I don't know.
That's maybe not conservative.
I've always been a right winger. Maybe I've always been like, okay, yeah, people are heterosexual. That's fine.
Right.
Maybe that's my sin right there.
That is, I think it's okay to be heterosexual. I'm not sure, but I think it is.
Canceled. You've been just been canceled right there. Boom.
Right. I've been canceled so many times. But on this bathroom thing,
no, it's terrible. The whole thing is terrible. Meaning, obviously, Nancy Mace is wrong.
Yeah,
Nancy Mace is wrong. I think that what they're doing now, that basically, like the woke people pushed in the last 4 years, wound up a backlash. And now the backlash people are like, well, we got a mandate to stop this trans shit. Like Speaker of the House, very important. Mike Johnson said, well, Scripture says men are men and women are women, and no, women cannot become men. And I was just like, oh, fuck. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know.
Like, I was just like, holy fuck.
My sense of this is we should insist that our politicians be able to negotiate their problems with each other one-on-one. And so
Nancy Mace, she did two things. She did like a protest. She put like a sticker on the door that said biological women. And I guess she's also put up a resolution saying no men in women's bathrooms. And it's like, and then we're back in the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson testimony. Well, what is a woman? And she's like, well, I'm not an expert. I can't tell you that. Meaning like, okay, let's say they pass this resolution, no men in women's bathrooms. Well, how are you going to adjudicate that?
Right. Like that boxer that the in the Olympics who was actually
two of them
born a woman, but
yeah, there were two.
Was intersex.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So had
Y chromosomes.
It was some Y chromosomes. Like it was not exactly clear.
Well, because there are non-binary people, like physiologically non-binary people.
Right.
There are intersex people.
So
rarely, but some.
I'm with you, but when it comes to gender affirming care, I side on the other side of it. Based on what I've read, I would be willing to change my mind if more evidence was brought forward.
That one of the theories of Elon Musk becoming a Republican that that's been floated by the New York Times is that it's when his oldest child, his son brackets, became trans. Right. It was that in COVID, because the COVID restrictions or whatever interfered with his business, right? And so that's the idea, is that he had like this self-interest in becoming a right-winger, and he was interested in free speech only insofar as people have the freedom to challenge the COVID restrictions and challenge trans orthodoxy. And, and it's just like, okay, New York Times, very nice. That's cute, And, in other words, it's because he's a cisgender, white, heterosexual billionaire that, of course, he found his natural home. He used to be a Democrat, but now he's a Republican. So he found his natural home. And, and I'm just like, okay, well, that might be true. In other words, it might be that Elon Musk didn't care about trans until it was his own child.
Right.
Doug.
Yeah. I understand.
So, I feel like that might be just a reality of human psychology. Might be, right? That you want to put the brakes on it, where it's like, okay, whoa, wait a second. I'm kind of okay with this in the abstract, but when it gets real, it gets a little too real.
Well, okay, but I would just say, in defense of Elon Musk, that if you have been told that a therapeutic intervention of a certain type, gender affirming care, is what will protect your child from committing suicide, will help them overcome their depression or their anxiety, and then there's an investigation into the studies that purported this, and they're found to be very weak studies, and that in fact it has not been established that this course of action will have a therapeutic.
There's an answer for that, Doug, though. The answer for that is the studies that have been done have not been good, and so it's only recently that things could be studied properly, and so the jury is still out. And the medical experts, the people who are actually treating people, they have the authority to advise and say that this works more than it doesn't.
Right. That's right. That is the answer.
People,
I do not believe that answer, because I look back on the history of medical doctors and how they decide lobotomies, hand washing. There's just so many examples.
One of my social worker students told me that ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, is still the gold standard for treatment of depression.
Right. Which okay, great. So that's what people
works better than antidepressants, works better than ketamine or psilocybin, but it's a stigmatized thing now. Although people still are treated.
Right. Look, the evidence-based medicine approach is actually relatively new. I mean, it developed, but
only in the last couple of 100 years.
No, I mean using it as a in the way that it's used now. The term evidence-based medicine.
Obviously that term. I hate that term though. I think it's so ideological. But go ahead.
Right. But the idea is that you do things based on rigorous studies rather than
studies and best practices,
which
that's
is anecdotal, which basically is a professional consensus, which
professional experience, though.
Yeah.
Granted that.
But look, just in the 19th century, these doctors would just
apply leeches.
Just do
but
anything.
Maybe leeches work better than all these big pharma drugs.
maybe sometimes they did, and
right.
sometimes they didn't. But in that time period, if you didn't see a doctor, your life expectancy
was higher.
Goes higher, So like, I'm just saying that my problem with gender affirming care is the foundational idea behind it is that there is such a thing as a gender that we all are born with that is different from our biology, and that being out of whack within a person is a malady which needs to be adjusted. And
I think that it's one of these things where this election, the thing that struck me about the election, going back to our individualism and collectivism idea, is that basically the Republicans kind of landed on a compromise solution that now they seem to be eager to violate via Nancy Mace and Speaker Mike Johnson.
Right.
Which is, it's fine for adults, just leave the children alone.
Right.
Right. And, Fazell, my husband, he reminded me that Ellen DeGeneres denounced Caitlyn Jenner as a fake woman.
Look, it's not easy. This is not a simple thing. And
I'm like, right? I wonder whether Ellen DeGeneres still thinks that. And, is she a TERF?
Not.
Right? Is she a TERF? Or, it's maybe secretly deep down she's a TERF or something. Right. Or was it because Caitlyn Jenner was a Republican? All sorts of things, right? And I kind of feel like, okay, so the culture wars are on. In other words, you might think that the culture wars were settled by the election. But no, the Republicans are taking it as a mandate to prosecute their side of the
right.
culture
No,
war.
Look, and obviously I oppose this idea that trans women shouldn't be allowed in women's bathrooms. And I support the rights of people to express their sexuality or their gender however
Zell
they
just
want.
said the obvious thing, which is, aren't there stalls in the bathroom?
Yeah, obviously.
It's like, and so it's like, but, look, I think that both sides are going to push it. I'm more critical of the Democrats because I do have a strong sense that it benefits the Democrats to wind up a backlash.
Right. No, this is politically, this whole thing is a big mistake. If I were in charge
of trying to
discipline...
not a mistake. Meaning, like, basically, the Democrats want LGBTQ people and people of color and women to be deathly afraid of the Republicans.
No, I'm saying for the Republicans.
Oh, the Republicans are making a mistake.
They're making a big mistake. This is like they were making a lot of headway with LGBTQ voters, and they could have won over the trans community if they had just played.
I think there probably are trans people who are pro-Trump too. Really, it sets Trump up in a position of being like the happy medium. That's true.
But do you think that my stance on gender affirming care is conservative or like not based
what I just thought though? Okay, when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, gender affirming care as opposed to sex change surgery.
Right.
Because that was the term. But now it's gender affirming care. And I feel like, okay, so we are in Orwellian land, right? Like it is sex change treatment, sex change surgery. That's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't call it that because it's gender, not sex. And because it doesn't necessarily involve like a physical operation on the genitalia, although it often does. Seems to be more soft touch than that, hormone therapy, which is itself quite dramatic in its effect.
It increases your risk of certain diseases like pancreatic diseases and such.
Osteoporosis, everything. Yeah, a lot of stuff. It takes away your ability to have an orgasm. I would consider that to be a major thing.
The puberty blockers do much more than the
hormone therapy as adults.
Yeah.
No, it
Yeah.
happens with adults too.
Yeah.
It does. So, you know, is it sexual mutilation? Children? I mean, again, it's kind of like, you know, I mean, I have news for you. The people who practice female circumcision would object to calling it sexual mutilation.
Right. Well,
They
look,
would say, no, this is how a woman becomes a woman.
I just, to the degree that it is anti-sex or born out of a fear of sexuality, or you know, that if that's what's being treated, I feel like it's not a very good treatment for that. But to the degree that it is an expression of actual desire in someone, and that they're working out, and that this is what makes them excited and happy, I feel like that, as long as it's, you know, consensual, and you know, I feel like to each their own, that's fine, and no one should be facing discrimination or the loss of rights.
Well, that's the thing. That's the basic thing, right? And so that's the other thing that we get from the civil rights era, though, and that does bring up the individual versus collective problem again, which is to say, you know, like, you know, country clubs could still discriminate in a way that a restaurant could not. Right? Because one is considered private and the other is considered public. Right? And so, you know, again, what the left would say is, well, any assertion of the private is bad. Everything is public. Right?
Right.
And so the idea that anti-discrimination means equal access and equitable access, meaning you need more bathrooms for non-binary, you know, or gender-neutral bathrooms than would be representative of the population, of the people who need that. Because that was the other thing that Fazell and I were talking about. It's like, well, can't they just have gender-neutral bathrooms in the Congress, Capitol Hill? Sure, they could, and they probably do. Right, at least to some extent. It's hard to imagine a public building that doesn't have those things these days, right? Or even a private building, for that matter. I mean, I guess I'm in academia, so what do I know, right? I'm in woke utopia, social experiment land. So, you know, but again, it's kind of like, it's the idea of equal access. In other words, that the respect for an individual's rights are to provide equal access on the basis of recognized protected classes of people. Right? So in other words, what's controversial is that trans are protected under gender discrimination laws.
Right.
That's what's controversial. And at a deeper level, what is controversial is the protected class idea.
I don't have a problem. Well, we should talk about the protective class idea. I don't have a problem if there's going to be that category for transgender people to be protected.
Absolutely, of course. In other words, definitely, right?
Right. So, but the gender affirming care issue is actually separate from that. It's not the same question.
It is.
And so when you said Elon only came to really care about this issue when his son/daughter received that kind of care, I thought, well, you know, a lot of people start getting involved in funding and supporting like cancer research when someone they love gets cancer. And
it could go either way. In other words, certainly having a trans child could turn you into a pro-trans activist rather than an anti-trans reactionary.
And I would just say being against gender affirming care could be considered a form of being pro-trans.
Well, that's true too. That's true. You know, right? Now, there are divisions in terms of what this stuff means and what the best, you know, I mean, I guess what we're talking about is the rights of individuals and how does one protect the rights of individuals and protect against whom, you know, against what?
Right.
You know,
I mean, the part of the problem is that we're living in a police state.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a big problem. And then all the other things kind of come out of that precarity that comes out of that. Listen, I've got to run for an hour. I'll send you a link in a bit. I want to talk about nuclear war again because it seems to be in the cards now, according to
Vladimir Putin.
And well, in response to Biden's policy change. So we should talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit.
Cool.
But yeah, thanks for doing the first half, and people should go sign up to the Patreon to see the second. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.